It's fun preaching a sermon every week from this chair, just talking to yourself.
Right. Just staring into the monitor. I don't know who I'm talking to, but
looking at yourself, preaching a sermon to you.
It's kind of how I felt when I was on stage the other week.
Yeah, pretty much. All right. All right, so I'll give it a couple minutes here. 11:59. Oh, yeah, we got like 3 or 4 minutes. Rich Brown hopped in. What's going on? Oh, hey, what's going on? You guys doing all right?
How's it going? Yeah, we're doing well. How are you doing?
Can't complain.
Just had a friend of ours arrested in North Carolina for marching.
Well, now he fits in with the apostles.
Yeah.
I can't name an apostle who didn't end up in jail for some reason.
True.
But yeah, I know a few people as well. I have friends who, for years, have been protesting the death penalty, and they kind of have fun to set up, and they get arrested all the time, and they bail each other out, and they keep going. What are you gonna do? All right. What time is it? 12 o'clock. Give it 3 more minutes or so. Today we're doing Tertullian. Anybody read about Tertullian at all? Any of his stuff?
I keep hearing him referenced and quoted, and I want to understand a big picture view of him.
All right, good. We actually have a lot of his writings. I mean, a lot of them were destroyed, but we have a good amount, and they're easy to read. He's a good writer.
Are they destroyed from time, or was it like a specific event?
Oh, a little of both.
Is this like the destruction of Alexandria?
No, we'll talk about it, but eventually, like some of them are just lost, but some of them, he had a kind of interesting turn at the end of his life, became a Montanist, and was declared a heretic.
Gotcha.
But all right, I'll go ahead and get started with the 3 of you, and then people will always hop in. That's what they do. Okay, Tertullian. Today, I've already started recording, so I don't know if I'm supposed to be like, "Hey, welcome to Church History for Lunch." I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody here and get rolling. So Tertullian, he was basically. We'll start with this. The last patristic father we looked at was Irenaeus, and he was an Eastern church father. And this is where we're going to start to see the difference between the Eastern church fathers and the Western church fathers. Okay, it's not just the language that they spoke. It's a lot more than that. So Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, these were philosophers. They were Easterners. They spoke Greek and read philosophy, and they had very philosophical views about God. Now we're getting into people like Tertullian, and Tertullian, typical Western, the Western church fathers, wrote in Latin, was a lawyer, a highly trained lawyer. Most of these guys were lawyers, Augustine, all of them, and so they communicate a very specific way when you read the Westerners. If you look at both, for instance, like Irenaeus and Tertullian, you begin to see the huge differences between Eastern and Western thought. So when you read people like Justin Martyr, you can see he's always quoting philosophy. He's wearing the philosopher's cloak. But Western fathers didn't think philosophy was appropriate. They didn't think secular thought was appropriate. Here's some direct questions that Tertullian asked. He said, "What does Christ have to do with Plato?" He's like, nothing. What do Christians have to do with the pagans? Nothing. What does the academy have to do with the church? Nothing. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And so he's creating this dichotomy right off the bat. He is saying these two things don't go together. They don't mix. And you shouldn't be trying to sort of put them together. Christians are Christians. Pagans are pagans. We don't mix their thought. And so he said the Christians have a whole different world, whole different view in the world, other than philosophy and lifestyle, thoughts, politics, all of it. So for him, Christianity and the secular are like oil and water. They don't mix at all. If you've grown up in a Christian home, like I did, depending on what your background was, Southern Baptist especially was mine. Southern Baptist homes, at least in the 90s when I was growing up, tended to eschew secular thought. You don't read their books. You don't engage with their writings. The philosophy education is dangerous. It can almost create this anti-intellectual bend. That is the outcome of sort of Western church father thought, like the patristic fathers of the West. Like this, you can see that vein running all the way through, except you see it skipping a little bit with the reformers. I mean, they didn't necessarily engage with secular works, but the reformers, Luther and Calvin, Zwingli, they did engage. They were what you call, they were humanists. They believed that they should read the writings of the early church fathers, and the Catholic Church did not. And they believed that we were capable of understanding these things. So there is this, though, anti-intellectual, anti-secular vein that runs through the Western church, and always has since the very beginning. So along with all that, another thing that sets them apart, the Western church fathers apart from the Eastern church fathers, is their desire for power and influence. They're perfectly fine climbing the ladders, getting famous, living in wealth. They tend to be very forceful in their arguments. They have biting wit. They have sarcasm. They want to be well known. They want to be sort of very forceful arguers. They're fine with insults, stuff like that. And so when you read them and you read the Eastern Fathers, very different people, very different writings, very different mindset. The Easterners were never really trying to get famous. They were just trying to have an impact, and they wanted their writings and their beliefs to be adopted and lived. The Western Church Fathers were an influence, okay? And the way you did that was through power. So let's talk about Tertullian specifically. His life, his full name, this is a beautiful name. I love it. Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus. I want to get it in one go. Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus. That's his name. We call him Tertullian. He was born in North Africa, in the city of Carthage, sometime in the 2nd century. We don't know when exactly. Late 2nd century. We want to say like 185 to 190s maybe. All we know about his youth is that he was basically wealthy. He had a great education. He grew up in a sort of an honored Roman household. But he did have this, apparently he had this from his writings. You can tell he had a wild streak. He indulged in every kind of like pleasure, drunkenness, sexuality, all of it. As a good citizen of Rome, honestly did. We don't know when he converted to Christianity. But we do know sort of some of the details behind it. My camera's crooked. That's annoying me as someone with a mild OCD. We do know a little bit behind it. We know that he became a follower of Jesus after watching Christians being ruthlessly persecuted. That had a big deal with that. That had a lot to do with his conversion, because he sees these Christians who were suffering and dying, getting dismembered and slaughtered and tortured publicly, fed to lions, burned at the stake. And as he's watching them hold on to their proclamation of Jesus as king the whole time, he can't help but be absolutely moved by what they are going through and what they're holding on to. And this inspires him, and he says, basically, whatever they have is what I want. And he goes for it, and he becomes a Christian. And so he's very moved by their persecution. And so throughout his writings, he's oftentimes dwelling on the glories of martyrdom. He understands how powerful martyrdom is. He's pointing out he writes to the Roman authorities a couple times, and he points out, he says, your persecution of the church has had the complete opposite effect that you wanted it to have. And here's a direct quote. He says, the more we are mown down by you, the more numerous we grow. The blood of Christians is seeds. That comes from his book, Apology. That's chapter 50. And pretty quickly after his conversion, he starts writing books. Like, he didn't waste any time. Smart dude. He starts writing books. And that was, he was basically, in his day, he was a huge deal. A lot of writings. One of the main reasons that he got a lot of attention in his day was that Christianity was predominantly, again, a Greek-speaking religion. and he was writing in Latin, and that was a big deal. Tertullian was like basically the first important theologian to write in Latin, the only one the first one to really matter. His writing style was really unique. He wrote all kinds of short, really brutally direct, completely uncompromising books against people he saw who were in error, okay? And up until that time, the general public had only ever interacted with Christian writings of like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and they were calm and they were reasonable and they were sort of loving and gracious. And then Tertullian comes bursting onto the scene, and he's making Justin Martyr look like an amateur. He is lambasting the Roman Empire. He writes with a lot of force. Picture like Martin Luther in his day. Martin Luther he appears to have interacted a lot with the writings of Tertullian. And being a lawyer, this is what they do. They point and they yell. And so he is rambunctious, and he is just lambasting the Roman Empire. And he was known for attacking everyone who disagreed with him. Everyone. Not just the pagans, not just the Roman Empire, but everyone inside the church as well, whom he didn't see eye to eye with. Anyone who he thought was in error, he would just go at them and say, here's all the reasons you're wrong. At one point, he actually says that what he most looks forward to, and when I read this, I was shocked. I'm going to read you a paragraph of his. But he talks about, in one of his letters, he's so irate in his writing in this letter. He's writing because at this time, everyone is, during his day, everyone is attacking Christianity intellectually, philosophically, physically. They're rounding up Christians and killing them. And so he writes to them this particularly angry writing. Do I have the reference? I can find it if you need it. Didn't look like I wrote it here. It says this. Here's his quote. He basically says that he looks forward to let me set it up. He says that what he most looks forward to about heaven is a good view of hell. And here's why. He says, what a wonderful spectacle bursts upon the eye. What about it do I admire? What do I laugh at? What sights give me joy? What do I exult at? As I see so many great kings whose receptions into heaven was publicly announced, groaning now in the lowest darkness of great Jupiter himself, and with all those who announced their exaltation, and the governors in the provinces too, who persecuted the Christian name in fires more fierce than the ones that they proudly threatened the followers of Christ with. And he goes on for quite a while explaining the torture he's going to watch them undergo. Okay. Not the happiest thing that you could read. He basically says, I can't wait to watch you all suffer in hell. And I mean, I guess if I could try to apply some amount of fairness to him, he was writing at a time when everyone was hell-bent on destroying Christians. And all these people who spoke with such great power and demanded to be worshipped, he tells them, I will watch you be brought down low. But he says it in such a way that you can't help but like pay attention to him, okay? So he's sometimes hard to read, but he's like, once you start reading him, you're like, you see his brilliance. So a lot of the arguments that he makes are brilliant, especially when he's talking about the Trinity. We'll get there. One thing about Tertullian that is that he's one of the few church fathers that seems to have actually, and I was just telling Daniel about this at the beginning, he seems to have actually fallen away from the church at the end of his life. He wrote a lot, but there's a lot of his writings that we don't have. Because for one reason, time, the ravages of time, we lose a lot of writings through time. Some of his writings that we have lost may still exist. Once in a while, we'll find documents in some monastery somewhere in Egypt, in some library that nobody's gone through for 500 years. And we'll find documents this way. And so we may find more Tertullian documents, you never know. But we know that a lot of his writings were actually destroyed and burned because eventually he became what's called a Montanist. It was a small sect of Christians that were very charismatic, and it spread throughout the early church. And most of the church rejected it, but there was a significant size of them that sort of became Montanists. And they basically believed that their leaders were receiving new prophecies from the Holy Spirit about church discipline, about Christian morality, about how they were supposed to live, things that seemed to go sort of specifically in the opposite direction of some of the things that the apostles taught. And so eventually the church sort of proclaimed Montanism a heresy, And eventually Tertullian starts writing against the church that he had written in defense of for so long. And so he starts writing fiercely against the church. We don't know what happened in the end. We don't know if he came back to it, to Christianity. Were you going to say something, Daniel?
Yeah, quick question. I was going to ask, for the Montanist view of theology, does that line up with like or modern charismatic theology at all, or?
No, this would have been different. They didn't have a canon of scriptures.
Okay.
And so they're basically, I mean, you'd have to really read into their stuff. I never spent a lot of time reading their writings. I know in basic forms of like what they were doing and why they were condemned. I don't remember any of the specifics, but I don't think they would fit in with any kind of Pentecostal charismatic movements today. Although gotcha. I do think, I imagine if you looked, it probably, may not be hard to find one or two leaders in sort of the holiness movement today that you could say that's more similar to Montanism than Christianity. And you can always find that. I mean, I see modalists all the time. And I see subordinationists all the time. I mean, John Piper was a subordinationist. That's a Trinitarian heresy. He believed that for a long time. And so did a lot of the Gospel Coalition guys. Some of them actually had to change their mind and be like, look, I realize this is a heresy. Even the Westminster Confession of Faith says that, and they gave it up. So like, you will find these heresies working their way through, and they've been condemned by the early church fathers, and they pop up and people grab onto them and they don't realize it's a heresy, and then they find out and they're like, oh, we're sorry. From what I know, I don't think John Piper ever, turned on it. That's where you get complementarian theology from a Trinitarian heresy. Subordination. Anyways, all right. Going back to it. So eventually the church sort of declares it a heresy. We don't know if he ever came back to the church. We don't know if when the movement fell apart, if he sort of changed his mind and came back. Interestingly, there was a group in the 4th century called the Tertullianists. We don't know if it's because Tertullian split off from the Montanists to create his own sect of Christianity, or if these are people that just love Tertullian's writings that were admiring his sort of like Methodists, you know what I mean, or Wesleyans or Lutherans. So there's that. Let me get into some of his thoughts, the way he like looked at the world and talked about it. So at this point, you kind of have to start with, let's see, he gave us a lot of firsts. I'll start there. One of the reasons Tertullian was really important, despite being a heretic later on in life. Normally, you read that and you're like, well, then why is he so important? Why would this guy who turned into a heretic and was condemned by the church, why is he one of the most important church fathers? Because he gave us a lot of firsts. Tertullian was the very first person to call the collected writings of the Christian Bible the New Testament. He coined the phrase New Testament. So we have him to thank for that. He was also the first church father to leave a large body of work for us to read about. He writes about baptism, Trinitarian theology in brilliant ways. He was the first to write about infant baptism. We learned that infant baptism existed from Tertullian. Nobody else is writing about this when he writes about this. And no, the apostles weren't baptizing babies. Not that I have a particular problem with it. We can do another thing some other time. Tertullian, he writes really around the year 200 or so on baptism. I mean, he's pretty young at this time too. He's writing on baptism, and in this writing, he begins to complain that some people are beginning to baptize these babies, and he rejects infant baptism, and this is where we sort of understand this. His biggest contribution, I think, to Christian doctrine is undoubtedly his treatment of two things: Trinitarian theology and Christology. And I've talked about these a lot. Trinitarian theology has to do with how we understand the Godhead, 3 in 1. Christology has specifically to do with how Jesus is both God and human at the same time. These are things which nobody was writing about because they were complicated. He's the first one to devote an entire treatise to the subject of the Trinity. And he's very clear in his ideas and his arguments about the Trinity, and nobody else is at this time. When people talk about the Godhead, they do so trepidatiously in his time. Like they're walking on eggshells, like they don't know how to talk about it. Because here's why. All through the Old Testament, God is obviously, they have this God that is binitarian. Two, there's Father and Spirit. And you can clearly see that all through the Old Testament. But with Jesus, with the revelation that God is like Jesus, with God in the flesh in our midst, something in this binitarian theology sort of breaks, and they come to realize that God is 3 in 1, Trinitarian. But nobody says it. Instead, you start reading the writings of Paul and the early apostles, and you see like, holy cow, when Paul talks about creation, he includes Jesus there, the Son. When Paul talks about them wandering in the wilderness, he includes Jesus, he includes Christ, the Son of God, in the presence of God there. When you see Paul, oh, what's going on, Ryan? When you see Paul doing, basically retelling the story of Israel, you see him adding to the binitarian Godhead this third one, Christ. And he doesn't explain it, but he's clear about it. If you want to read more about this kind of stuff, and this is where Tertullian, he was the first one to nail this down. He goes into detail about how we are to think of God in light of Jesus and in light of the writings of Paul. Okay, so Gordon Fee was a master about this stuff. So he wrote 2 books about this, about Paul's view of Jesus. And they're important to read, and they're really good to read. Gordon Fee, Paul, the Spirit, and the people of God. He writes about sort of the role of the Spirit. Okay, and the other really important one here is I'd read this one first, honestly. Gordon Fee's Jesus the Lord according to Paul the Apostle. So who was Jesus according to Paul? In other words, like, who does Paul think Jesus was? What does it mean that he's Lord? What does it mean when he talks about when he starts including him in the Godhead? How does all that work? So I actually studied under Gordon Fee's daughter, Cherith Fee Nordling. She was the most brilliant woman. When she talked, the whole room just like was gripped because she would run around and yell, and it was wild. It was great. So those are book recommendations that I have. So he's the first one to really, Tertullian, the first one to really lay out sort of Trinitarian theology rather than duality, okay? Rather than sort of binitarian theology. He includes the Spirit, the Son, with the Father in the Godhead. He's the first one to talk about God and the substance of God. And this idea of the substance of God would be really important like centuries later at one of the big Christian councils, the church councils called the Chalcedon. And they have this massive argument over the substance of God. Is Jesus, is the Son and the Father the same substance? Is the Spirit and the Father of the same substance? And to talk about this, they all go back to Tertullian, and they open up Tertullian's writings. That's why he's so important. So like some people, you know, when you hear that one of these church fathers was declared a heretic later on, and he runs off and chases Montanism, a heresy, and he's kicked out, you tend to think, well, then he couldn't be a good church father, but he was massively important. He's incredibly important as a church father, even though he's rude. So it's important to realize, again, at this time, the doctrine of the Trinity had not been fully developed. The doctrine of the Trinity isn't fully developed really until 325, the Nicene, the Council of Nicaea. The reason the first council was called at Nicaea was because of issues of Trinitarian theology and Christology. How is God 3 in 1? And how is Jesus both God and human? And there were all kinds of people offering up all kinds of ideas. And the reason these councils happened is simply for those 2 questions, okay? And the point of these was to lay out, if you go this way, that's a heresy. If you go this way, that's a heresy. This is orthodoxy. And every time after that, all 7 really ecumenical councils that gathered together were all about the same subject. They weren't new subjects, although once in a while they'd have an argument over like, when is the date of Easter and blah, blah, blah. The reason these councils were called was to look at the new heresies about the Trinitarian theology and Christology, they'd come up and they would look at these theologies and they'd say, we need to call a new council because there's all sorts of new ideas about how to describe God and how to describe Jesus. So it would come back together and they would add to and expand the first Nicene Creed, and they would make it bigger and they would expand it. And the last one that we have, the real last ecumenical one we have, it's what's called, it lays out what's called Apathetic Language, which is like speaking of God without speaking of God. So what they say is, apophatic means negative. So they say, God is not this, and God is not that. God is not, he's not divided. He's not of different substances. He's not of this and that. And that's how you define God, by not defining God. And the thing we learn, we're all way off topic, but who cares? The thing that is most important to understand about the councils, about all the Christian creeds, is that when you try to define God, you always fall into heresy every single time. Someone's mowing the lawn out here. It's making a lot of noise. Whenever you, even today, if you try to define God, this is where subordination comes from, this heresy that some of the Gospel Coalition guys had struggled with. They're trying to define the role of Christ. And so they say subordinationism. Jesus is subordinate, eternally subordinate to the Father. When you say that, you're defining sort of the attribute, the relationship of the Son and the Father. And when you specifically define it in that way, you're committing a heresy called subordinationism. And so the best way to talk about God is generally, not very specifically. And if you must be specific, use the language of the church fathers, use the language of the creeds, use the apophatic language, use all that stuff. But when people sit down and try to, here's water, sometimes it's ice, and sometimes it's steam, and sometimes it's liquid. If you've ever heard somebody say that, they're a heretic. That is modalism. Okay, that's not a good way to talk about God. Just stop being specific. Stop trying to talk about God like that. Don't describe God. So here's one of the things he says about Christology. He says this: the truth is, we find that he is clearly set forth as both God and man. This was Tertullian, by the way. Certainly in all aspects, as the Son of God and the Son of Man, being God and man, differing no doubt according to each substance in its own qualities, inasmuch as the Word is nothing else but God, and the flesh nothing else but man. And so he's a lawyer, and he's saying, if this and this, then it's this and this, and you can't be this without this, and you can't be this without this, and if it's this, then it's this. He's a lawyer. That's what he does. So if you want to read more, I gave you the recommendations for Gordon Fee's books. So some general things we can glean from Tertullian's writings. He believed, and these are interesting to me, when I wrote down some of the most interesting things I found studying his stuff. He believed in absolute monogamy and faithfulness to a single spouse, even after they died. Okay? Not all church fathers agreed about human sexuality. But the Westerners typically followed Tertullian. And his main point was, you married somebody and you stay committed to that person, and if they died, tough luck. You were married to them and you were still married to them until the day you die. So that's how basically he would argue. It's an interesting thing I thought of his. Second, he also believed that all of the sins that you committed before you were baptized were forgiven, but not the major sins that you committed after you were baptized. So he didn't go into a lot of detail about whether he thought you should be baptized again then. Like he doesn't say it, but he basically says, if you're baptized, like you're on stage, do it right from here on out. It's sort of like, the reset button on the Nintendo. And especially he singles out murder, adultery, and apostasy, those three things, which is interesting because he became an apostate. So he was, the biggest thing that you can actually find in his writings, other than the Trinitarian and Christology stuff, is that he was a pacifist. Even though he was his writings seem brutally violent, like when he talks about gleefully watching people suffer in hell from his point of view in heaven. He didn't believe Christians could serve in the military. He didn't believe that, another one I forgot, he didn't believe women should wear makeup or anything of the sort. Just throw that out there. Back to the pacifism. He regularly wrote about pacifism and the many arguments that the Christians would have against it. let's talk about some of this. In Tertullian's day, just like in our day, there were a lot of people who would say they would read the writings of Christ, which obviously portray Christ as nonviolent and suffering and forgiving, rather than committing violence to even protect himself or anything. And he's always trying to stop his people from an uprising. But people in Tertullian's day were just like people today. They would read the Old Testament and they would say things like, well, here's what he says. He says, if you don't agree with Jesus about what Jesus believes about violence, they might say you can use the Bible to try and find a loophole. You could point out that violence of 1 Samuel that says, go attack them with the sword and destroy all they have. Do not spare them, kill them, women, children, and babies. So he points out that like a lot of Christians use the Old Testament to silence Jesus so that they can take part in violence. And he lays out arguments against this. He even says, to answer this, he refers to Gethsemane, where Jesus yelled at Peter and told him to put your sword away, live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. Tertullian points out, and he says, how will the Christian man war? Nay, how will he serve in peace without a sword, which the Lord has taken away? For albeit soldiers had come unto John and had received the formula of their rule, albeit likewise a centurion had believed, still the Lord afterwards is in disarming Peter, unbelted and disarmed every soldier. So he says, when Jesus disarmed Peter, Jesus disarmed every apostle to come after him and every Christian afterwards. He says, when Jesus told Peter to put down his sword, he was telling the entirety of the church to put down their swords, because the church is built upon the seed of Peter. And so this is what he believed. He called Christians, he said the Christian is, quote, the son of peace. He or she is the one who has traded away the ways of the world for the ways of Christ, trading the sword for the cross. Tertullian also made a lot of the interactions of the weapons of war with his day in his rebuke of Peter. He a lot of times pointed back to this interaction that Jesus had with him. So he didn't believe, again, that Christians could serve in the military. He didn't believe Christians, and the main reason was because they couldn't bear the sword. Some people will say, no, Christians couldn't serve in the military because it required emperor worship, which is true, but Tertullian says, no, it's because it required violence. Other church fathers like Hippolytus directly said, if you're in the military, you can't be a member of the church. That's what he said. And so there's all this ancient stuff from the early church, and that we kind of have to think about, that we should ask questions of why, and then what does that mean for us now, today, our role in church. And I don't think the question for us is, who should we keep out of the church? I think the question is, how should the Christian live? So in 212, he even wrote this rebuke of voluntary enlistment to the military, which he absolutely confirms his disapproval of the practice of serving even in higher offices of government. He doesn't think the Christians should serve on boards, on senates, or anything like that. So yeah, we don't know how he died. From what we know, some early rumors were that he lived a very long time into his old age, and at some point stopped writing and went silent. So, I mean, kind of a sad ending to the guy. He did amazing work right up front. A lot of the things that we believe about about Trinitarian theology start with him. But again, you can see, I think one of the good reasons that we should jump back and forth from Western to Eastern fathers is you can see clearly how different they were, how differently they handled the Bible. And some of them you can look at and you say, I cannot believe this guy believed that. And that's what you will constantly come to over and over and over again as you read church history, especially in the patristics. I think next we're doing Origen, which is my favorite. And when you read them, you're like, there's no way. This doesn't sound Christian at all. And that tends to be how we treat each other a lot of times too. We meet other Christians and we hear what they believe and we condemn them because they don't believe what we believe. But oftentimes we forget that we are the descendants of specific church fathers that oftentimes interpret stuff in specific ways that others did not, and they have different streams of thought. And so that's what the councils were for, the ecumenical councils, to bind all the Christians together under who is God, who was Christ, all that together. So that's Tertullian. read his writings. Really good arguments. If you're going to read some, don't just stick to one side, Eastern fathers or Western fathers. Read both. You'll see where Luther gets his flair. You'll see the angry streak in some of his later in his writings that will pass on to his descendants. Any thoughts? Oh, good primer on his writings. Apology. Read his Apology. It's really good. Start there, and then from there, let me see. I wrote down. I made a bunch of notes in here. Oh man, give me a second. Good man, Irenaeus there. All right. Some of them, did I even write them down here? One of them he wrote is called Against Praxis, and that's basically about how to think of the Word of God. He has this long thesis about how to understand John's writings and his uses of the phrase "the Word." And actually, when you read that, he sounds very Eastern. It's interesting. I think he's interacting with Justin Martyr there. What else do we got? Also, another part of Against Praxis. It's Praxis. Let me write the title there. So read his Apologies first off. Read his Apologies, and the second one is called Against Praxis. I believe that was Praxias. It's going to try to autocorrect. No, it did. Praxias. Stop correcting my writing. Praxias, as I believe the opponent he's writing against. That's why it's called that. He has one called On the Flesh of Christ. I hate the sound of keyboards. Against the flesh of On the Flesh of Christ. That's his one, obviously, about the humanity and the divinity of Christ in one. So read those; they are fascinating. I picked up a really nice bound collection of Tertullian's writings years ago for like $4 on Amazon. Not hard to get. You could download them all for free, actually, too. Oh yeah, and then Rich Brown is asking which writings. So there you go. There's some of those. Yeah, digital writing online. Everything should be online of his, mostly. But I'm a collector. I like to put the books on the shelf, line them all up, and be like, Church Fathers, here we are. My books are my friends. I can never get rid of a book, even when I hate. People are like, why do you have so many books? You should get rid of some of them. No, I would never get rid of my friends. Who would win in a fight, Tertullian or Origen? Origen would never fight. Oh, wait. Are you talking like intellectual, maybe, or physical? They would just hug each other because they were both pacifists.
Intellectual.
Oh, intellectual fight. Tertullian, Origen would do riddles, and he would ask questions and make philosophical statements. I like to do that when people are arguing with me, like when people were posting a lot about like riots in the streets during Black Lives Matter protests. I like to post like African proverbs, like what did I say? I wrote that one that was like the child who has been oh man, I wrote it down. It was really good. The child who has been pushed away basically his entire life. Child who has been rejected, that's what it was. The child who has been rejected by the tribe will burn it down to feel its warmth. And so this is the kind of stuff that like Origen would do. Like you try to mount an intellectual argument against him, he's going to come back with a philosophical quandary or a pun or something like that. Yeah, that's Tertullian. But give him some reads, and that's all I got. It's good to see you all. I hope you had a tasty church history lunch. And I guess that's it for me. I'm going to go get myself some bacon and eggs because I didn't eat breakfast yet. All right. Take it easy, guys.
Take care.